Hello again. Today I'm writing an expert advisor based on a simple Bollinger Band reversion. This is a strategy that was sent to me some time ago. I've already included a number of my standard functions that you've probably seen before. I won't be going through those in detail. I'll put them up on the screen for a few seconds if you want to copy them down, but I won't describe how they work here just to save some time. I'll probably make some other independent videos where I describe each of those. I'm also just going to write this as the description came to me, so I'm not going to embellish and try to add any extra features. Now, also to save time, I've filled in most of the expert background already, I suppose. You'll notice one thing: I do define app version, description, copyright, links on here at the beginning, and then I set the properties rather than put the values directly into the property. This is just a habit I have because I often write experts where I have a common file where I'll put these definitions, and also if I want to use any of these values later in the code. So this is just what I typically do. I'll be using some of the standard includes that come with MetaTrader: the account info, position info, symbol info, and trade. And I've declared the objects for handling those. So see account info, position info, symbol info, and trade as obviously trade, symbol info, position info, account info. Now the first thing I'm going to need are some inputs. And the first input will be to define the Bollinger Bands that are used in this. Now the strategy is when the price moves outside the band, then depending whether it moves above the band we sell, and if it moves below the band we buy. So it's a very simple Bollinger Band reversion strategy. So obviously the band period, very bad typing here today. So right, the band period is obviously the Bollinger period, deviation, number of deviations away from the mean, and then the band margin points. I actually want the price to go outside the band by at least 50 points, and I'm using points here, not pips. So they're much easier to handle because they are a defined value within MetaTrader. And again, I'm defining the stop loss and the take profit in points, which I will convert later. You'll notice straight away very large stop loss and very small take profit. That's the way this strategy is set to work. Take lots of small profits and the occasional stop loss. So we'll see how that goes. Now by default, this will only allow one position to be open at a time, and you can only trade once per bar. So if you trade and the position closes, you still have to wait for the next bar. So this input volume per K, if that is true, then I'm going to increment the volume based on the size of the equity. So, and that would be, in this case, 0.1 lots per 1,000 of equity. If that's false, then this is just 0.1 lots for every trade. And the usual things: a magic number and a trade comment. Now I have some inputs here that are in points. Usually when I write this kind of code, I don't worry too much about performance. I'll just write it, make sure it works first, and then I'll leave tweaking for performance later. But there are some things that I just do out of habit because I know they always work and I'll always do them. And one of those is that whenever I have an input in points, I'll convert that to a double once at the beginning of the code. Once I, for example, convert this input band margin points, which is entered as 50 points, once I convert that to a double, it becomes 0.005, then I don't need to worry about multiplying by the size of a point anywhere else in the code. And then one more global variable, I want something to determine if I have already traded, because I have this trade once per bar. So now on init, I do have these objects for symbol, position and so on. The symbol and the trade need a little bit of setup. Okay, so here, first the symbol info needs to know which symbol we're using, and I'm setting that to the chart symbol. After I've done that, I call symbolinfo.refresh and then symbolinfo.refresh rates. And if either of those fails, then I return init failed. Now the difference between these two, refresh sets up values in symbol info that are typically not going to change. Things like the number of digits, they will be constant while you're using the expert. Where refresh rates will set up things like ask and bid prices, which do change all the time. So I'm calling them both. I actually don't need the refresh rates here, but I'd rather call it at least once to make sure that's working here in the init. It doesn't really take any time. And then I'll reuse it again when I'm in the on tick section. And then there's a one-time setup of the magic number in the trade object from the input magic. Now this is where I set up those double values for the inputs that were in points, and here's the first of the generally useful functions that I have, points to double. So I've already written that. Let me just go down below. So points to double, and normally I would have these in an include file, but for these videos I'm copying them into the end of the expert. And as I said, I'm not going to describe how these work. I'll have it up on the screen for a few seconds and then I'll just move on. So here I'm creating the indicator handle. Handle bands equals iBands function, symbol period, band period, deviation shift. And I'm using price open for this because that will give me the price that doesn't change while that candle is open, and then it only changes at the beginning of the next candle. And I realized that I haven't set up this handle bands variable, so I'll go back and do that in a moment. But if that's invalid, then I just print an error message and return init failed. So now let's go and set up this handle bands. So the handle to an indicator is just an integer, but you'll notice I've also defined buffer count bands as 3. That's because the Bollinger Bands indicator returns 3 different values, and I want to know how many of those, and you'll see that used a little later. Now because I have created an indicator, I should release that when I'm finished. So in onDinit, that's all of the setup. I'm just going to compile to make sure I haven't made any typing errors, and I haven't. On tick, we're going to have a bit of work in here, and then I will create a number of specific functions for this expert, which I'll add in here above all of these general functions that I've already included. So these value upper and lower are going to be the limit values from those Bollinger Bands. And I'm only calculating them once when each bar changes because, as I said, price open doesn't change while the candle is still open. So I don't want to calculate them every time there's a tick. So here I have a standard isNewBar function, so I'll go to that now. You may have seen this many times before, and I will make a new video where I explain how this works. I've had a couple of little changes since I made the original video on it, so I'll make a new one, and when I've done that I will add a link in the description to this video. Then after the isNewBar, so if this is a new bar, has traded this bar is false, and then I set up a buffer to get I set up an array to get the buffer values from the indicator. I call a function indicatorGetValues where I pass in the handle to an indicator, the index of the bar where I want to get the values, the number of buffers that the indicator has, and then that array that will be returned. And this is another one of my standard functions, so I'll just go and look at that. And the reason I have this number of buffers, I could have simply set up the array here to be the appropriate size, but I just found it easier to pass in a dynamic array. And so this function steps through all of the buffers on the indicator based on that handle and gets the value for a specific index. So it doesn't return an array of values from a single buffer, it returns an array of values from a single index for each of the buffers. And this is another one of the standard functions, so I'll just leave this for a few seconds and then move on, and I'll probably bring up another video at some point just to describe this. And after that, then value upper is just the upper value from that buffer plus the margin around the bands, and the value lower is the same thing minus the margin. And then if for some reason the value upper is 0 or the value lower is 0, then that should never happen, so I'll just return because I've got invalid values. If the input trade once per bar is set to true and we have already traded, then I'll return. So obviously if we've gone through the new bar, then that is false. But as I get to the code later, you'll see that once we do trade, that gets set to true. Now here I'm saying if we've input that we only want a single position and the count of positions for this symbol and magic number is greater than 0, then we have too many positions, or we already have at least one position open, so I'll return. This is another standard function, so let me just go and see that. Position count passes in the symbol and the magic, and it just does a select and a simple loop to count through, and it counts 1 for each position that matches. I won't describe this in detail again, but this also uses another standard function, position select by index, and that's passing in the index, the symbol, and the magic number. And here is the position select by index, which in turn uses the position info, which already has a select by index, but that only takes an index. I also want to test the symbol and the magic number, and that's why I have my own position select by index that takes the symbol and the magic and returns false if any of those don't match. Now calling symbolinfo.refreshRates gets the latest values for things like bid and ask prices. If I don't do that, then the values that were there the last time the refresh rates were called will stay. It doesn't matter how long it goes, so they never get updated. So I call that here. If that fails for some reason, then I'll just return because there's no point in going on. So I'm grabbing the bid and the ask values from that symbol info. I could have just used these functions inside this code. I just felt like grabbing the values here into individual variables. But if the bid price is greater than the upper limit of the band plus the margin, then we're selling. So I'm setting the order type to sell. And if the ask price is below the lower limit, then the order type is buy. I'm comparing the bid here because for sell trades, the bid is the entry price, and for buy trades, the ask is the entry price. And if I get to this line, I have initialized the order type to -1 here, which is an invalid order type. So I'm saying if the order type is less than 0, then it means I didn't go through either of these lines, and that just means that the price is somewhere in between the upper and the lower band, and so there's no problem there. It just means I haven't got a trade. So then I just return. And if I get to here, then I'm just going to open a position for that order type. Now, open position is another custom function, but it is specific to this expert. Okay, all that's happening here, I'm declaring the open price, the stop loss price, and the take profit price. And as I'm looking at this, I realize I could have passed the open price in because it is either the ask if we're buying or the bid if we're selling, and I knew that when I called this function, so I could add another argument there for the open price. But if it's a buy, then the stop loss price is just the open minus the stop loss, and if it's a sell, then the stop loss is the open plus the stop loss, and obviously the opposite for the take profit. And at the beginning, I declared that there were two ways of calculating the volume. There was either a fixed volume, or the volume could be set based on per 1,000 of equity. So I'm using a function get volume to give me the actual volume there. And I'll just write that function now before I go on any further with the open position. Okay, so the volume, if this is input volume per 1,000, then it's the input volume multiplied by the equity divided by 1,000. That's obvious. And if not, then it's just the input volume. In case this is being calculated, and I guess in case you've entered an invalid volume, then I'm calling the normalized double function on that volume, and I'm passing in a value of 2 here. This is a quick hack, and it's not good practice, because that's not really the way volumes work. Not all volumes have 2 digits, and not all volumes go up in increments of 1. So even if they have only 0 digits, they don't necessarily start at 1 and then 2 and then 3. In fact, I recently came across an instrument that traded in 4 lots only. So there are better ways of doing this, but I don't want to take up extra time in this video showing how that happens. So I'm just adding this quick hack, and I'll make another video at some point where I show how to normalize volumes. Now this is the standard position open function that comes with the ctrade class, and if that fails, then I'll just return false. Okay, and if we get to this point, then has traded this bar is true and returns true. Now you'll notice I'm returning false if this fails and true if it succeeds, because this is a Boolean open position, but I don't use the value of the return. It's just my habit to include that as a Boolean, even if I'm not using it here. And I think that's everything. So I'm getting the upper and lower values of the Bollinger Band, adding the margin to those. If I've had a problem with the value upper and lower, then I'm returning. If I'm only trading once per bar and already traded, then return. If I only allow one position and there are more than one position, open, return. If there's a problem getting new rates for the symbol, return. Determine the bid and ask prices and determine the direction of the trade, and then open a position if we've broken outside the bands. Let's compile. I have an error, semicolon required, there. And because I copied that line, that will mean I'm missing one there as well. That worked. So let's give this a quick run and see what happens. So I'm going to run this on Euro USD 30-minute chart for 1 year from July 23 to July 24. And I'm going to leave the inputs at my defaults for now and just see how this goes. So the results on this are not very consistent, and I suspect that over time it would not trend either up or possibly it would trend down. It has made a profit in this case, but over a year, $1,500 profit on 10,000. That was using volume per 1,000 of equity. I've got 10,000 equity, so if I set that to false and just use a fixed value, but I have 10,000, so at 0.1, then I should have one lot, 1822, slightly better. I don't think this proves anything one way or the other, but there are plenty of numbers in there for you to play around with, and it's a starter piece of code if you want to modify this to work in different ways. Like I said, I've written this as it was described to me. I think there are some things that can be modified in it, and I might come back and do a version 2, but I don't want to make this video any longer than it needs to be. So we'll wrap that up there. I hope this has been useful for you. There is no download for this code at this stage, so you just have to follow along and copy. If you found it useful, then click like, and if you want to see more of the videos, then subscribe and click the bell icon and you'll be notified when I release the next video. Thank you for watching.